Super. All right. Well, I'm going to be talking today about resource-efficient exposure assessment. And so in the spirit of being resource efficient, I'll also introduce myself. Isn't that great? So hi. Good morning. Good job, everyone, being here. Christy Peruznik. And you've heard me talk about probably other things before at other times. And today I'm going to talk to you about 3 studies, one of which is happening and has been happening for almost 2 years, one of which just got started, and one of which we'll see if it gets funded. But it's not coming from federal money, so hey, that's great. So the title, A New Paradigm for Exposure Assessment, Hope and Beyond. And I put Karen in parentheses, in part because it's all her fault. No, because when we got HOPE started, Karen was working as the study coordinator, and actually she's probably home today since now she's at NIH, but I have to give her some credit for making some slides. The projector turned off. It's got bad flashiness going on. All right, anyway, so let's improvise. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. That would be not good improvisation. So let's get started. I'll talk about the HOPE study. And, oh, hey, look, they came back. That's good. All right. So when I'm talking about resource-efficient exposure assessment, what I'm talking about is collecting exposure data at the right time in the right way, whether that's by using a questionnaire or by collecting a biospecimen in order to answer the research question. This is something that's relevant, probably to all facets of epidemiology, where our goal is to classify people by exposure status and by outcome status, like you're exposed or not, and you're sick or not. And we've got to have some way to get you into the correct box. Because if we're doing our exposure assessment badly, then we might put you into the unexposed box when you're really exposed, and then our answer is going to be wrong in the end. I mean, this is what it all comes down to, right? Putting people into boxes. And if we had our sort of ideal Star Trek Big Brother world, where we're all wearing some kinds of monitors and collecting continuous data all the time, then you would be able to know whether or not I had a high exposure to diesel particulates this morning. I did not this particular morning. But that would not be the sort of thing that would maybe be so easy to collect via a questionnaire in 2 weeks. Maybe if I had an asthma exacerbation today and one wanted to know if a transient exposure of particulate matter had something to do with my asthma exacerbation, you might say, oh, well, thinking back to the 24 hours before your asthma exacerbation, did you have a high exposure to particulate matter? And I'd probably be like, I don't know. I stand at a lot of bus stops. A lot of other buses sit there. I mean, maybe. So, a lot of times we'd really like to have actual environmental monitoring, but it's just not possible because we don't have that kind of technology yet. So we do rely on questionnaires, which may be useful. Other times we can figure out how to collect biospecimens at the time that we care about. And that's something that we're doing in the HOPE study. I do think that it's really important to underline this point about the right data at the right time in the right way for that question, because there may be plenty of research questions for which a continuous trace of my environmental exposures is overkill. Like, we don't care. If the exposure that you're interested in is secondhand smoke in the home, that's probably something I can answer via questionnaire. And so this is something that, if you've heard me talk about epidemiology study designs, I'll talk about how people give no love to ecologic studies, like blah, blah, lowest on the scale of evidence, and everyone wants to do randomized trials or cohort studies. But I just want you to keep in mind that if you could answer your research question with an ecologic study or with questionnaire-based exposure assessment, then do it. I mean, right study for the right question. Don't waste a lot of time and effort trying to, collect saliva so you can measure cotinine to know if I had exposure to passive smoke. You could just ask me, or smell my closet, I guess. All right. Why do I particularly care? Well, early environmental exposures matter. There's mounting evidence, both from human studies and animal studies, that exposures that actually happen during the fetal period and potentially even before, so exposures that happen to the egg that will become you and to the sperm that will become you, may actually have long-term effects on your health and development. This is now referred to as the developmental origins of adult disease hypothesis. They used to call it the Barker hypothesis because of the guy that first started talking about it. And there's a whole book called Origins that's like popular press, kind of summarizing a lot of this literature. One of the things that I'm interested in are outcomes that are very hard to study, things like probability of pregnancy and miscarriage. And when we're talking about those, really early exposures around the time of ovulation, which may be conception, may be really relevant to whether or not you go on to have a miscarriage. Okay? But here's the problem. That means you've got to be tracking prospectively to know who gets pregnant, to know who loses that pregnancy in the first 2 weeks before they might have even noticed that they were pregnant. Tricky, huh? All right, so let's talk about how people typically do reproductive epidemiology, and then I'll tell you how we're doing it better. Well, a lot of times with reproductive epi, people will use a case control study. This is a perfectly reasonable choice. Why? Because the outcomes that we care about are generally rare, right? Birth defects don't happen that frequently, thank goodness. And so if you were trying to do a prospective cohort, enroll people preconception, and the thing that you wanted to study was birth defects, you'd need a really, really giant cohort in order to have enough cases to then say anything meaningful. Okay? It's just not feasible. But if you do a case control study, you can enroll people once you recognize that they have a birth defect or not, and then go back and look at exposures. There's some bias problems here. The mom there might be recall bias because you may be asking about exposures that happened quite some time earlier. And depending on the case status, the reporter may have a different motivation to either remember exposures or think of exposures that maybe even weren't there at the time that you're asking about. We've got selection bias if we're doing this because we're limited to the people who delivered. At this point you've missed miscarriages or people who never conceived at all. And there's also there's a selection bias here because usually if we're recruiting for a case control, we're recruiting for in a hospital because that's where we have people. And so, then you'd miss the home births. Now, granted, it's not a lot. It's about 1% nationwide. But I submit to you that, that 1% of people who are electing to deliver at home are probably different than the people who are delivering in a hospital and may have had many other exposures that were different along the way through that pregnancy. So if you can't do a case control without bias, maybe a cohort study. Well, if what you care about is a pregnancy outcome, then it would be perfectly reasonable to recruit people who are pregnant. So people try to do this often at a first prenatal visit or maybe by a 20-week visit. But there is selection bias here as well because we are including only women or couples who are pregnant, which means you've missed the people who never conceived. And so any exposures that were affecting the probability of conception, you can't really study that. You're also selecting for people who seek prenatal care by that certain time, whenever it is you're recruiting by. And I mean, if it's 6 to 8 weeks, then that's selecting for people who are self-aware enough to recognize that they're pregnant by 6 to 8 weeks, which, I mean, we all think that we would be, but, there are people who might not be. There's sort of an interesting bias here that women with really big families, maybe they're on their 4th or 5th pregnancy, may be less likely to seek early prenatal care because they're like, I know how this goes. You know, I'll go in about 20, find out if it's a boy or girl. I mean, I'll be fine. I know how I'm supposed to feel. So you may, you know, it may be not that you're selecting for people who are, you know, not interested in healthcare. It's just like, why bother? Different. Information bias can also happen here. We may underestimate miscarriage because if they have to have stayed pregnant up until the recruitment period, they won't be there. And the part that's interesting to me is that if you recruit during pregnancy, some exposure that you might be interested in might have already stopped, or it may have dissipated. If you're interested in, you know, a birth defect that relates to, say, a heart defect, then you would need to do environmental exposure assessment during the first couple of weeks of a pregnancy when that heart is developing. And if you wait to recruit someone into a study until even 6 or 8 weeks, then if that exposure that was relevant had happened earlier and the exposure was gone, then you couldn't really measure it. What am I talking? I don't know, like applying pesticides to your house, for instance, and you want to know what sort of a burden that person might have had. So, so here are some limitations of things that people do currently. If transient exposures that could have critical influences on fertility and sensitive periods of early development might be missed if we're not looking for exposures during that time. And if we really want to do lifetime exposure assessment, we need to start at or near the time of conception, which means that the time of ovulation must be identified prospectively, which, you know, may seem that it can't work, but we're doing it. I'll tell you how. So if we say that exposures before conception can influence the probability of conception and pregnancy outcomes, and exposures before the pregnancy is recognized can influence development and outcomes including miscarriage, then we need to measure early on, because by the embryo has actually experienced significant development. That the heart is formed by 22 days after conception and the neural tube by 28 days. So by that point, depending on how long a woman's typical menstrual cycle is, her period may be less than 2 weeks late. And, you know, if you just think, oh, I'm stressed, it's finals, someone just died, we moved, you know, things like that people believe can make them late. And they may not think, oh, dude, I'm pregnant. I guess I should stop installing new carpet and applying pesticides and painting this new house. So anyway, there's a lot going on before anybody gains weight. So here's the bottom line. That if we're ever going to figure out the relationship between acute, transient, environmental exposures and biological events, then we need to do our exposure assessment at the biologically relevant time. And in the HOPE study, we are applying the physiology of natural family planning to trigger exposure assessment in a preconception cohort. Okay. So here's the basic idea. We're recruiting couples. TTC means trying to conceive, in case you don't hang out on pregnancy chat boards. So we're recruiting couples trying to conceive as early as possible in their reproductive journey. And we're teaching them the peak day method, which is a simplified fertility awareness method that we've developed. So simplified that we teach, it's a 3-page brochure that you read yourself with 3 sample charts. And people get it, okay? Not for pregnancy avoidance, by the way, but for couples who are trying to conceive, we're basically teaching them to identify when they're likely to ovulate, and then we have them collect biospecimens based on that recognition. Okay, and then we also have them complete a pile of questionnaires, but they're all electronic, so it doesn't look like a pile. For something that I think is really cool, that we're also building into this study a retrospective component. Okay, so just bear with me for a second. We've got couples who recognize, oh, hey, I'm going to ovulate soon. Hey, I just ovulated. And we do biological specimen collection at that point. We also have them doing some daily diary exposures. Okay, so that's all prospective. And then what we're doing is 6, 8 weeks forward in time, we have them think back to the time of ovulation so that we can simulate what happens in more typical studies where people are enrolled at, say, a first prenatal visit. Okay, we're doing that retrospective again at that ovulation plus 38 weeks to simulate if they had been enrolled at delivery and thinking back to that exposure assessment. Lisa?
Is the diary electronic and they don't have
The diary type exposures are actually on their paper fertility chart.
So they could go back and check.
We have collected it by then. So
okay.
Only if they made a copy.
Okay.
And I would be really impressed if anyone did. But
Are those out there?
I suppose that there are those out there. You or I might be that person. And I didn't think to protect my study from people like me. Anyway.
We'll call us a small fraction of the population.
We will call that an exceptionally small fraction of the population. Thank you.
No, but I'm saying if you ask me retrospectively and I still have my diary hanging around, I can just go check my diary. Oh, it's not the same. It's in the same person around the daily diary.
Okay. All right. So here's the impact of that. That if they conceive that cycle, and remember these are couples trying to get pregnant, then we actually have biomarkers, biospecimens that we can test for exposure the day of conception and actually through implantation for that baby, which is pretty cool. So the primary exposure that we're measuring is BPA, bisphenol A, that plasticizer that people care about in first morning urine. And our primary outcome for this study is actually time to pregnancy. Okay. Why do we do that? Because pregnancy takes too long. And on the scale of a study period that's funded for 5 years, I don't really have time to recruit people, wait for them to get pregnant, wait for that baby to be born in order to see a pregnancy outcome as a part of this. So that's why we're having our primary outcome is time to pregnancy. And also because there's some evidence that time to pregnancy is actually a fairly sensitive indicator of reproductive insult. That if maybe you, man, have a high exposure to BPA, which is an endocrine disruptor that we know is bad for sperm, then maybe it's not enough to actually make you infertile, but maybe it's enough to reduce your semen quality so that instead of getting pregnant in 2 menstrual cycles, you get pregnant in 3, something like that. And for any individual, it's probably not a difference that you would notice, because otherwise we'd probably be noticing in the population. But if what we're seeing instead is a shift in the population distribution, so that on average, instead of 3 or 4 cycles trying, it's taking people maybe 6 or 7 cycles trying to get pregnant, then what's happening is maybe that tail of the distribution is getting pushed into a category where they get an infertility workup, so on and so on, because it's taking longer. Think about it kind of like what happened to IQ with lead and gasoline, that any individual person was probably not that much lower scoring on an IQ test, but the population as a whole shifted down. All right. The other thing about BPA is hot. People care about this chemical. And so as a part of our study, it seemed like that would be a good thing to propose studying because people want to know about it. From our perspective, a lot of what we're doing is really a demonstration to show that we can do this kind of exposure assessment, and it should be done, and you could do it for any sort of transient exposure. But BPA was a good one to choose because, Canada says it's toxic. We don't really know how much we're getting. And here's the other thing. So here's a chemical structure for BPA. And this is the structure for DES, which is the poster child for endocrine disruption. DES was a medication given to pregnant women in like the 50s, 60s that helped control morning sickness, but then it turned out was associated with rare types of cancer in the female offspring who had been exposed in utero. Okay, and if you put your organic chemistry hats on, the chemical structures here are pretty similar. They don't, I mean, they look twisted in there, but there's the same kind of thing going on. BPA is also an endocrine disruptor, and yeah, this report, Disrupted Development, just came out last month from the Breast Cancer Fund, and it's basically like a literature review that they've put together of all of the studies talking about prenatal BPA exposure and then what has happened to the babies and or the kids. I got to tell you, most of these studies have really lousy exposure assessment. But you know what? It was the best they could do at the time, so we'll give them that. Okay. But here's the thing. In our study, oh, this is in the wrong spot. But since we're measuring prospectively and retrospectively, we can estimate how wrong other studies are from only measuring retrospectively. I lost a slide there. Anyway, most of these studies that report about the impact of prenatal BPA and later childhood outcomes were based on single measurements in urine. So like mom came in for her 20-week prenatal visit, peed in a cup, as you do at pretty much every prenatal visit, somebody saved it, and later they have gone back and analyzed that for BPA, and these kids are now like 6, 8 years old and say, oh look, mom's high BPA during pregnancy is associated with hyperactive behavior at age 8, you know, from one single measure 8 years previous. Yeah, so here's the HOPE study. We're recruiting couples. Mom and dad have to participate. Can't just have mom, can't just have dad. Got to be both of them. If they're planning pregnancy within 3 months, then we will recruit them for inclusion in the study. If they say that they want to get pregnant but in later than 3 months, we put them in kind of a holding pen, and Kylie and Nicole check in with them. Hey, have you changed your mind yet? Because sometimes, you know, even though they say, oh, we're waiting 6 months, that doesn't mean they're actually going to wait 6 months. So we don't want to lose these people. The women need to be between 18 and 35. For men, they can be a little older. We're having them, we want them to live within about an hour of here because we have to drive back and forth to pick up all their specimens. And we only have capability to do English. So you might have seen this poster. We have been in the FYI newsletter, which is a surprisingly good recruiting tool, although we are not in the current one. Really? I glid through it and I didn't see.
It's an announcements of interest at the very bottom.
Oh, gosh. All right, scroll to the bottom. That's the thing. We're doing, so some of our most successful posters have actually been on the campus shuttles, by the way, and I think it's partly because we have this, the QR code on there that when you're riding the shuttle, and, you know, you could scan it with your phone and it goes straight to our screening questionnaire. Because here's the thing, if you're trying to recruit couples of normal fertility status, you got to get them, because otherwise they get pregnant really fast, and if we need them preconception, it doesn't help if they're already pregnant. Okay, we are recruiting on Facebook, which has been a pretty good way too. That when some happy participant pregnant couple, oh, I'm pregnant, I did this study, then their friends sign up. We also have a recruiting incentive so that if participants refer somebody else who signs up, then they get a bonus, which is good. We did do some advertising, and that was plus or minus. You can all help now. We're still recruiting. If you know people who are trying to get pregnant, live around here, send them our way. They can find us on Facebook or email hopestudyutah@gmail. So once we get them all consented, we actually do an in-person enrollment visit. So we actually measure height and weight. We collect a hair snip. We don't have a plan for what to do with the hair yet, but you know, we're talking about environmental exposure assessment, so it's good. We give them all their the collection devices and charts, and give them their booklet and tell them when to do what. Okay, don't freak out about this. We don't show this one to the participants in just this form, but I just wanted to walk you through it. So we enroll people at about, you know, towards the end of a menstrual cycle, or right at the beginning of a new menstrual cycle, because we want to be sure they're not already pregnant. Okay, and so the beginning of the cycle is first day of bright red bleeding. Okay, so as they're using the peak day method, it means they're observing changes in cervical fluid, possibly basal body temperature. So at the onset of fertile quality cervical fluid, means they're getting ready to ovulate, then we start having both mom and dad collect daily first morning urines. Okay? So that this way we will have urines that we can analyze for exposures at the time of ovulation. Okay? Once they've ovulated, cervical fluid dries up, their temperature goes up if they're measuring. They each collect saliva specimens for us. And then the dads can stop collecting urine, although a lot of them keep going for a couple days. But the moms keep going and collect daily first morning urine all the way to the end of the cycle. So this way, we can measure changes in pregnancy-related hormones. You know, we can do really early specimens where it looks like there's not a pregnancy. We can see if maybe there was a clinical pregnancy that was a very early loss. We're not doing that yet, but we could. Or, if what you cared about was an exposure that was affecting development at 10 days post-conception, we've got that specimen, okay? We're also collecting a semen specimen. Well, the couple's collecting it and giving it to us, somewhere between the end of the fertile window and the beginning of the next cycle. And we know they're in the next cycle because she either starts a period again and is not pregnant, or if she gets to ovulation plus 18 days, we've provided pregnancy tests for couples to take. And so then either Nicole or Kylie or Lindsay will visit them and collect all those specimens and give them a new set if they're not pregnant, or they're done. And then they start doing the retrospective assessments. So they collect biospecimens for up to 2 menstrual cycles. And if they're not pregnant after 2 menstrual cycles, they keep on charting for us, but we're not having them collect specimens anymore. All right, so we're doing a lot of questionnaires where we're trying to measure things like BPA by a questionnaire that we can use to go along with our biospecimen. So here's all the specimens we're collecting. The urine, semen, saliva, hair. Turns out our partners at Center for Human Toxicology developed an analytic method for BPA in saliva. Turns out to be not a very good matrix for analyzing BPA. So we're not doing that analysis anymore, but we're still keeping the saliva because you can do other things with it. Well, one can do other things with it. We're holding on to all this stuff. I just bought a -80 freezer to put this in. So we're banking 50 milliliters of urine a day that we could use for future analysis. And we have consented the participants for that. They can opt out of the specimen banking and still participate in the study. It just means that we'll analyze their stuff for the BPA and then not put it in the bank. And we already have started entering into discussions with people at other universities who are interested in our biospecimens. So that could turn into something interesting. All right, so here we are. Kylie helpfully updated this as of yesterday. We've been recruiting since January 2012. So since then, we've had 618 inquiries, and 418 of those couples are eligible. You might be ineligible if you're too old or have diagnosed infertility, stuff like that. Among that, we've enrolled 202 individuals, which is 101 couples, which is 48%. I gotta tell you guys, this is fantastic to me. Because this is, we're asking them to do a lot. Collecting, daily fertility charting, collecting a lot of urine, charting intercourse. There's a lot going on here. And yet, we've enrolled 48% of those eligible. 43 of our couples have completed. 50, well, I may not have updated that 56. The rest are still in progress. We've had also really low lost follow-up. We've lost 1 couple to follow-up. 1 withdrew. They decided they didn't want to get pregnant anymore. And 2, we mistakenly enrolled when they were already pregnant. So I think that this speaks really highly of the study staff and how we've been interacting with people so that they're not dropping out once they're like, oh my gosh, I have to collect all this pee. Our couples are, I don't know, I can't decide if that's old or not. But anyway, the women are 26.9, men 28.4. There's our ranges. I want to talk to you about compliance because when I was proposing this study and as I've talked about it at conferences and other things, people look at me and they're like, and they say, no one's ever going to do that. Guess what, they're doing it. So, let's just talk. This is an initial look from last winter, but at the point that we cut this for the women, we had 87% compliance on the urine specimen submission. And for most women, we're getting urines for about 20 to 25 days. So this is saying, 100% would be they gave us every specimen we were expecting. That's pretty good, considering that, people take trips, and we're not expecting them to carry it back through TSA or anything. That would be crazy. For saliva, for females, our compliance was 96%. For men, it was even crazier that we were expecting 239 and we got 248. Mostly, to the correct time, and then there was some sort of spillover that maybe they kept collecting because they hadn't had the conversation of, oh yeah, I ovulated, you can stop. Whatever, we'll take it. That's great. Saliva, we had 95% compliance for the men. And then the thing that also is just really extraordinary, 92% compliance on the semen specimens. That's great. Really happy about that. All right, let's talk about pregnancies. So far, we've got 18 live births, 7 miscarriages or early pregnancy losses. So this is about what we'd expect based on what people report about proportion of conceptions that turn into miscarriage. And kind of exciting because we're getting to the kind of numbers once we wrap up enrollment where we could when do people get pregnant? Well, so far 28 or 30% of our pregnancies have 30% of our couples have conceived in cycle 1. Okay? So this underscores how important it is to get to people fast, because this means that they are pregnant within about 3 weeks of enrolling in our study. Okay, another 13% of our couples have conceived in cycle 2, so that's 40 of our pregnancies that have happened in either cycle 1 or 2. This is awesome because remember that's when they're collecting their biospecimens. Okay, we have some pregnancies happening later, 9 in cycle 3, 1 in 4, some in 5, 7. And there are so far 35 couples who are not pregnant, but a lot of them are still going. Okay. So this is presenting the timing of our closest first morning urine specimen relative to conception date. Okay. So if they conceived in cycles 1 or 2, then we actually have a urine specimen for the day of conception for 85% of those pregnancies. Pretty cool. These ones where we don't, dang it, did you know a lot of people try and get pregnant around Christmas? And you know what else they do around Christmas? They visit grandma and other places. And so for a lot of these conceptions, the reason why we don't have specimens is because they were traveling. Frustrating. For our pregnancies that have happened after cycle 1 or 2, when we're not collecting specimens, it's longer from when we have the specimen, but still for about half of them, it's only 2 to 4 weeks. And in other studies where they talk about periconceptional exposures, people have used, defined the periconceptional time as long as the year including pregnancy. So, 2 to 4 weeks is still pretty good, but we're really happy about this day of conception stuff. That was our goal. All right, this is our time to pregnancy, which is our primary outcome. Let me orient you to this a little bit. The blue on the left was their time at risk of pregnancy before enrollment. So that was their time trying before we actually enrolled them in the study. Time 0 is when they enrolled. And then gray are months of follow-up that they're still going. These yellow ones have completed follow-up without getting pregnant. And red was months of follow-up until pregnancy. Now, here's the good news. We actually have quite a bit of variability here. And so, maybe we'll see something with time to pregnancy as our outcome. All right, so here's your call to action. We have actually noticed a dip in enrollment with the start of the school year, and that's perfectly reasonable. Like, lots of stuff going on. Many of our participants are students, or they have kids who are students. So, you can help refer people. There's tear-off sheets if you need any. You could scan our code with your phone and blah, blah, blah. All right. Oh, here's our Facebook page. And we have more likes now, but it's still not that many. All right. So what are we demonstrating with this study? An efficient means of timing exposure assessment, particularly for transient exposures with short half-lives. This is more cost-efficient than doing just daily collection and analysis, since we're timing to the fertile window. This is better than recruiting people who are at risk of pregnancy and just having them collect urine every single day. Okay, and then we can use this to time exposure assessment to developmental windows. If the thing you cared about was developing at 3 months post-conception, then you could use a design like this to actually identify when they conceived. So then you could know that at conception plus 3 months, you go and take that blood specimen or do whatever it is you do. Okay, and we're also demonstrating good compliance in our population of real people. Oh, by the way, we're paying people up to $400. So that probably helps a little bit with the compliance. I mean, if you do everything, it's like you could get a stroller, a good stroller. All right, so here we go. So that was HOPE. So the next big thing. Exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals like BPA, it's ubiquitous. Okay, in our study, we have 100% of samples, 100% where BPA is detected. Okay, even those super crunchy among us who think that we're avoiding BPA, you're not. Okay, you might just have less than someone else. BPA exposure has actually been associated with a bunch of bad things like immune dysfunction, implantation failure in women undergoing IVF, alterations in male hormone levels, decreases in sperm quality. But BPA is actually really hard to measure meaningfully because it's got a short half-life, about 6 hours. Okay, so if you measure first morning urine today, it basically tells you what you ate yesterday. Okay, and if you were traveling, visiting your family that eats a lot of processed food, then your levels would go way up, and then you get back home and you eat out of your garden and the farmer's market, and your levels are going to go right back down. Okay, the daily variation, even within our study, has been dramatic and shocking. There was a great study that was done at Harvard a couple of years ago where they did a crossover trial with canned soup and fresh soup. And they had a bunch of public health students that either ate canned soup every day for lunch, a measured amount, or fresh soup made with similar ingredients. And the BPA levels were something like 1,000 different. Yeah. Anyway, so doing a spot urine specimen, which would be like when you come into the clinic for your prenatal visit and you give a urine specimen, that's a spot specimen, or any single urine measures, such as our first morning urine, don't really capture that variability. In our study, we've seen 21-fold variation from a single first morning specimen to that same person's geometric mean. Big difference. So some people say, well, then we just have to collect it all. Like, really? Can you imagine, having all of your study participants with just a jug, and every time they have to collect it and pour it in the jug? I mean, no one's going to do that. All right, so here's what we're seeing in HOPE. These are the geometric means over the cycle's worth of samples, okay? So we have every day's sample, and then we take the geometric mean of that because there's so much variability, okay? And nanograms per mil. So, I mean, we're seeing a distribution. There are some people where it's quite low, but this is the whole population and women and men, and there are some people that are quite high, okay? It actually is statistically significantly higher in men than women, by the way. This is just comparing single day values and then their cycle level values. And so the gray is for a woman's estimated day of ovulation, we picked 2 days later. So if we only had 1 day for that woman, we picked, and compared to her geometric mean for the cycle. And so you see, the distribution is still similar, but what happens is people may wind up in different categories depending on what happens. So this is showing the relative differences, okay? To be able to say from our single day specimen, where would we classify you compared to what we have for the geometric mean for that whole cycle, where would we classify you? The reds are from cycle 1 and the blacks are from cycle 2. And so for most people, the ratio between that single day to the geometric mean is between 1 to 2, okay? Probably not that big of a difference, but there are some people in the 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 or 5 to 6 or even more than 6-fold difference, okay? So here's the thing. If urine's the best we've got, you can't measure BPA in blood. It's useless. What can we do that's better? Well, we're working on a pilot study to develop a method to measure BPA in sweat in collaboration with the Center for Human Toxicology. In the olden days, when people wanted to measure things in sweat, well, even maybe now, the way they did it was they put you in a sauna and gave you a little like scraper in a cup. So you'd sit there and sweat and like scrape it, okay? Also, not very efficient. But might be kind of fun. It turns out that you know those patches that people use to deliver nicotine or fentanyl? You can also use them instead of going through the skin to deliver drug to capture the sweat that is coming out of your skin, okay? And so what we're doing is having people wear a sweat patch continuously for 7 days. You can still shower because there's a cover that goes over it and protects it. We're also collecting daily first morning urine and exposure questionnaires during that time. Because here's the thing, if we're collecting sort of a 7-day integrated exposure assessment, that should help even out some of that daily variability, and we'll get a better idea of somebody's usual exposure than just a single-day specimen, which might be completely influenced by that can of SpaghettiOs that they had last night. Okay. So how's it going? Well, we just started this in August, and our recruitment is nearly complete, which is exciting. And I got an update from the Center for Human Toxicology, because this is brand new, right? When I was telling people about this at the Environmental Epi Conference this summer, they were like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You can't do that. I'm like, well, I am. So I'll let you know next year if it works or not. And if it was stupid and it didn't work, then you don't have to try it. But in the meantime, don't tell me it won't work, because it might, right? This is science. It's discovery. And it's working so far. I mean, they're developing the method, and part of the method development is like taking sweat patches that nobody's worn and like squirting stuff on them, and then seeing if you can get it back off the patch, okay? And they say that the analyte is reproducibly extracted from fortified patches using a simple shake with methanol. I mean, that's great, okay? So the idea is, you know how much BPA you squirted on the patch, and then you see if you can get it back off again and measure that. And in the range of 0.5 to 10 nanograms per pad, that's pretty good, okay? This is making me feel really hopeful. And so when we finish up our recruitment, they'll start analyzing our real patches, and I'm really looking forward to hopefully going back to the Environmental Epi Conference next summer and being like, yeah, it worked. Good job.
Not that I mentioned this off the top of your head, but struck me, what's a typical sweat load?
It is highly variable per person, and I do not know the answer to that off the top of my head. But the other thing is that 95% of the BPA that you ingest is excreted via urine, and so there's a lot less of it available to go out via the sweat mechanism. And so, although we see ranges of multiple nanograms per mil in urine, it's going to be scaled down into sweat. We've had a few people that their patches came off early, possibly because they were too sweaty. But, this is just the pilot. Maybe you don't actually have to wear it for 7 days, maybe 3 days, or it's still going to be better than a single urine. Go. No. Because in order to save our analytical resources, we are, he's going to see that the method works, yeah, and then analyze them as a batch. So Dave thought that by next week he would start to, try on some of the real patches. Lisa.
How much variability is there in the analytic method from day to day? So if you analyze some people on Monday and some people on Thursday, should they be the same as if you do them on Monday?
That is part of the running the internal standards, so that there can be some scaling factors. Yeah. But the way that these go through a liquid chromatography mass spec analyzer, and so every time you're running internal standards, and you do a whole bunch of samples kind of in a batch. So maybe these 10 are on this standard, but you can still compare across because of the standards. All right, so that's the thing that's in progress. Now the thing that we're waiting to see if it gets funded. This is something moving much more towards personal exposure monitoring. Most environmental monitoring occurs at the ecologic level, okay, which makes perfect sense. I mean, we really are mostly breathing the same air, right? But not completely. You know, people breathe at different rates, they have different microenvironments, and maybe we're missing important variability by assigning all of our air pollution exposure to the monitoring station down at Hawthorne School, okay? You know, if you live up Immigration, your exposure is definitely different than the people who live across 7th East, okay? But we don't have a great way to measure that. But technology is developing to put capability for individual level monitoring literally into people's homes and hands. And I think the thing that's really interesting and appealing about this is not only the potential for continuous monitoring, but even better, the possibility to give people information back. Okay, so there are people, not me, but people who have developed these tiny little air quality monitors that literally plug into the headphone jack of your iPhone. Okay, like one of those square credit card readers. I mean, that kind of a thing. And it is almost within the realm of actual possibility that if you had one of these things, you could plug it in, monitor the air quality where you are, and then it sends it off to some computer in the sky that will send you back a text message to say, here's the levels, no, you should not go running. Or, if you're cooking in your house and you're cooking a stir fry, which generates a lot of particulate matter into the air, then it might beep to tell you, hey, open a window, reduce your particulate matter. I mean, that's pretty cool to think about. So the proposal we have under review for the University Air Quality Seed Grant applications is to add home-level air quality monitoring to the HOPE study in collaboration with a professor down in electrical and computer engineering. And along with that, we are going into a new direction of biomarkers. So there are these things called isoprostanes, specifically F2 isoprostanes, which you can measure in urine. And it turns out that they seem to be a decent epidemiological biomarker of oxidative status. So this is a marker of cell damage, basically. And other people have used these biomarkers to evaluate exposure to air pollution in China. Okay, so what happened was they had people, healthy volunteers, and they collected urines during the Olympics when China had all those air quality restrictions in place, and their air quality got so much better, but it was still like our worst day. And then after the Olympics and the air quality restrictions were all lifted, they collected specimens from the people again, and their levels of F2 isoprostanes went right back up. So, it's a suggestion that it could be associated, that particulate matter air pollution is associated with oxidative damage in the body that we may be able to measure with isoprostanes. Now, there's plenty of other things that can cause oxidative damage as well. So we'll see, The other question is, would these be a useful biomarker of exposure to air pollution in places like here, where although it can get pretty bad in the winter, it's not China bad. And so, we'll see. This is research, right? I have collaborators at Duke University who will do these analyses. And they've pretty much developed the methods and validated. And okay, so there's two small world stories that go with this proposal. One is that when I was first looking up about isoprostanes, and I was like, hey, look, there's a review article. That's great. Review articles are very helpful for learning things when you don't know much about it. And the next really great thing was, oh, wait, I know the person who wrote this review article because we went to grad school together. So that when I wanted to learn about doing the analysis, I could call her and say, hey, tell me about this. And how expensive is it? And can you help us do it? And all this kind of thing. So the lesson is, be nice to people in grad school because you never know who you're going to collaborate with later, okay? The other, crazy small world story is that my collaborator in electrical and computer engineering has another collaborator at Michigan who's developing the things that plug into the iPhone. And so he's telling his guy about our project and tells me his name, and I went to college with him. Okay, so be nice to everyone because you never know when they're going to pop back up in your life. So, what's the potential impact of this potential study that hopefully will get funded? Well, if isoprostanes are a good marker for particulate matter air pollution in Utah, for exposure, then, we could analyze stored specimens to predict historical levels of particulate matter where there weren't monitoring, perhaps. This is all like down the road. These are the big kinds of things that you put in grants because maybe it'll work, right? But I think the bigger potential impact is actually on the side of the devices, that if we can enhance personal monitoring devices to be able to provide close to real-time feedback to people about how they could change their exposures, this could be huge. For somebody who does have asthma or COPD, if their personal exposure monitor starts going up and is approaching some threshold, maybe even before the person realizes it, then the monitor can send them a message back to say, hey, why don't you take that medicine? Or stay inside to maybe avoid emergency department visit or something like that. It could be bigger than just should I run outside or not. I think there's also a possibility to be able to use these really small, relatively inexpensive monitors that can go anywhere for doing global health type work. The World Health Organization has a big initiative about indoor air quality. It's one of the biggest contributors to disability worldwide, primarily because of people cooking on biomass stoves and cooking in poorly ventilated areas. And so there are many different interventions going on trying to encourage people to change their stoves. But it turns out that people don't like change. And so, maybe if you could somehow show people about the levels that they're breathing in, it might help behavior change to accept the new stove that someone's going to give them for free. Or you might even be able to evaluate the impact of that intervention a lot easier than trying to install a full-on monitoring station in someone's kitchen in Guatemala, which is not likely to happen. So here's the thing. If we want to answer some of these fundamental questions about how environmental exposures affect health outcomes, then we need to do resource-efficient exposure assessment at biologically relevant times. And we, right now, in Utah, are creating this science and technology. Isn't that cool? That's all I got. Oh, so I was trying to think about what pictures to put up here for the question time. So these are from Cedar Mesa, which is in southern Utah, and a population that is not there in that spot anymore, maybe because of environmental exposures. Any other questions?
Question about the hope studies that began in January 2012. Is that when funding began? So is it 5 years from there?
No, funding began in August 2011. It took quite a long time to get through the IRB. And also, we didn't want to, I think we got our IRB approval right before Thanksgiving, but kind of holidays and stuff did not seem the right time to kick off. And so we targeted it for January. We did actually enroll our first kind of test couple in December of 2011 to work out the kinks.
So you could potentially bring in new couples for the next year?
Yeah. Yeah, so probably about the next year and a half. Our goal is 300. We've got 101. We'll see. Go.
Just curious about the attention to potential confounders in this study. Are you looking at the biomarkers or metabolites from alcohol, from like the ethanol from beer or martinis or wine? They produce acetaldehyde, which is a severe effect on the reproductive system on fetal toxins.
Mm-hmm. So if those type biomarkers are stable in urine, we sure could. To my knowledge, it doesn't affect the BPA metabolism, and so we're not presently. We are asking about alcohol exposure on the daily diaries. And all of our population are in Utah. So yes, they have alcohol exposure, but no, it does not tend to be that high. Joe?
It doesn't matter for your study because it's prospective, but are you getting the impression that people being enrolled into a study where they're being told they're being monitored for BPA is changing their behavior?
So we have a questionnaire about that, that we have people do kind of a baseline questionnaire at enrollment, and then we can compare to some of their other exposure questionnaires to try and see if they're changing their behavior. I don't think that they are for this, in part because it's so hard to do, that the people who care seem to have already tried to do it, and the people who don't care, don't care. But you know, a lot of our processed and packaged food exposure, which is the main place that we get BPA, you didn't open the package, right? Like if you eat out, you're getting BPA because you know the soup that you get at some place where you get soup probably came out of a can, you know, at some point, or it was packaged in plastic, and there's just no way around it. Have any of you heard about the BPA in thermal receipts? Okay, so if you really wanted to avoid BPA, you also can't buy anything because it's in those sort of thermal receipts. And for those of us whose career is not as a cashier, I mean, so you handle it and you throw it in your purse or your pocket or whatever, you don't have a lot of exposure. But people whose job is cashier and who are touching these all day actually get an interesting level of exposure from that other exposure to BPA. They did those folks at Harvard love to experiment on their students. They did a study with the thermal receipts and people who were not cashiers and had students handle receipts for like 3 hours, possibly the most boring study ever, that the participants seriously, like, they're crumpling them and they're flattening them out, and they had to keep handling them for 3 hours. And their BPA spikes were shocking in their urine. So yeah, you know, and in terms of things like if people are cutting back on smoking or drinking because they're in the study, it's hard to tell. Because they're also trying to get pregnant. And so many of those things people attempt to change when they move from avoiding pregnancy to trying to achieve pregnancy. So we're trying. Go.
One other comment. I really like your study. I wasn't aware of how much you were doing in this area. I'm on record with the Salt Lake Tribune about 5 years ago saying we should ban BPA. And it was ironic because I started to get some flack from some of the industry, and then Canada, thank God for Canada, banned it.
Not closed. Hooray for Canada.
What I like about your study, what really enthuses me is you're looking at dose, and that's really the bigger issue.
Mm-hmm.
You have off-round routes of exposure to skin, ingestion, and so on. And the dose is what's going to make the difference.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the 6-hour decomposition. That's assuming a normal, healthy person.
True.
And if the person is sick or on some over-the-counter drugs or prescription drugs, it's going to change that decomposition.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of other factors.
Mm-hmm.
You consider.
Mm-hmm.
I like the way you're doing this.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, it's like trying to measure caffeine. That most people have some, it's pretty habitual, but it changes through the day and it changes day by day. I mean, good luck on that. Maybe we can do it in sweat. Well, thanks for listening. Refer people if you can, because we would love to actually hit our recruitment targets. Okay.